So let's talk a little more clearly, get into the nuts and bolts of kingdom friendships. I want to start by saying a few words about their importance, and then we're going to look at 6 distinctive qualities of a kingdom friendship as opposed to less intentional, less purposeful friendships that we so often find in our world today. First, a word about the importance of kingdom friendships. Now, when we're talking about kingdom friendships, the way I'm going to use that phrase, that might be a covenant friendship. That might not necessarily be one that is covenanted, right? So by kingdom friendship, I'm going to mean something that's intentionally kingdom in its purpose and in its focus. Sometimes that kingdom friendship might actually have an explicit covenant that's made around it, an actual ceremony that binds the partners into a covenant friendship. But my guess would be most kingdom friendships will not have covenants explicitly made around them. And I think that's fine. I think one has to be very careful about the number of covenants one enters into and when one does that. Covenants, I think, are few and far between. Generally, we operate in this world with good relational principles to all of our relationships. Occasionally, God will call someone to explicitly covenant around a particular relationship. But whether we covenant or not, we can have intentional, kingdomly principled friendships all through our lives in these various spheres of intimate, good, and casual. Let's also remember that while some of us might be called to marriage, all of us, I think, are called to have kingdom friendships. I say that because in our culture today, particularly over the last 100 years or so in the Western culture, marriage, romantic relationships, sexuality, all the things that come around romance and marriage, that type of relationship has literally been deified. It's become an idol in our culture. For most people, they certainly want friends, but they imagine a desolate life ahead of them if they don't have a marriage partner, a spouse. Interestingly, when we look at Jesus as our model, Jesus never had a human spouse for his 33 years on earth, but he had close friends. Jesus, in his life, prioritized friendship over marriage. I think we need to think about that pretty clearly. We are called, all of us, to deep friendships. Some of us are called to be married. And let's remember this as well. This is simply an important operating principle of all relationships. Let's get to the heart again of what is a relationship and why is it important to the kingdom of God. Remember in Genesis 1, God created humans with the intent purpose of being his images. That something about us would image the kind of God he is. And as we've seen, the kind of God he is a relational God. That at the very core of God is Father, Son, and Spirit. That our God is a community of love. So for us to image God, a big part of that imaging is going to be done as we are in relationships that image God's inter-Trinitarian relationship, the love between the Father, Son, and Spirit. That means that every relationship we enter into is to have the kingdom purpose of reflecting the kind of agape love that God is. What this means is that every relationship is composed of 2 important things: the persons that make up the relationship and the relationship itself. We often neglect that second element in our Western culture. Instead, because of the individualism of our culture, when we think relationship, all we tend to think of is the people in the relationship. We forget that the relationship itself, something we can't see with our eyes, but something that God recognizes as a spiritual reality. When people come into committed relationships, certainly this is the case for covenant, but it can be the case too for other committed kingdom relationships, that relationship is an entity in itself. It's a thing. It's a metaphysical fact. We neglect this in our culture. We think of the persons and the relationship as sort of a vague idea. But I would propose to you that God sees relationships as living entities. For example, when a man and a woman make a marriage covenant, something new comes into existence on the day of the vows. It's the marriage. And the marriage isn't an idea, and it's not a piece of paper in some courthouse. It is a living spiritual reality that we can't see with our eyes, but that is nonetheless very vital and real. And here's the thing. Both the persons in the relationship and the relationship itself are precious to God, because it's persons in relationship that images the triune God who's in relationship. In other words, persons, well, that reflects the persons of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit, but the relationships, our relationships, they reflect the oneness of God. That is why we must hold as precious both persons and relationships, because relationships are a third thing that emerges out of the people, and it's part of the spiritual beauty that allows us in our relationships to image the triune God who is relationship. And this is true for every friendship we'll ever have. The quality of our friendship's relationship images the love of the triune God. So let's look at 6 key kingdom qualities of relationships dedicated to the kingdom, what I'll call kingdom friendships. And the first is this, that a kingdom friendship is going to have at its center a kingdom purpose and clarity about that purpose. Kingdom purpose and clarity about that purpose. What I mean is this. We can fall into friendships quite easily, but it takes intentionality for us to say, in any of our friendships, that the most important thing of this friendship is to have each of us growing into the image of Christ because of this friendship. Aristotle once said that the 3 important qualities of friendship were enjoyment of each other, helping each other meet needs, but he said most importantly, pursuing virtue, character, and the good together, by which he meant God. Well, the Christian tradition agrees with that. Elrod of Ravoux, a 12th century Christian, wrote one of the most influential books in church history on friendship. It's called Spiritual Friendship. And in it he said something very much like Aristotle. He said that friendships usually involve enjoying each other. One likes to be around one's friends. They involve helping each other, usefulness to each other. But he said the most important quality is a third thing, and it is that it is kingdom in its intention and its purpose, that it's focused on God and growing God's character in each of us, that that's the real heart of a kingdom friendship. So intentionality of purpose becomes absolutely essential to a kingdom friendship. Whatever way it got started, its purpose becomes encouraging, mutual support, challenge as we grow each other into the image of Jesus Christ. And for that to happen, this will require clarity, and clarity only comes through conversation. Any time that conversation does not clarify, it allows the possibility for mismatched expectations, as we've talked about, and a whole host of other things that will make the friendship difficult to sustain over time. Let me just touch on a few areas that I think friendships really must process and talk through if the friendship is to be protected, if the relationship is to be nurtured, if it's to extend and grow over time. Now, the first we've already mentioned, but I'll mention it again because it's so vital, is that we have to talk about shared expectations for the friendship. If one person's expecting this and one's expecting that, and they don't realize that difference of expectation, that will produce tension, and often the friendship cannot survive that. Once this is clear, then talk of compromise can happen, and we can become sharing the same ground in terms of our intentions and expectations as we talk through them. Secondly, we have to talk through personality traits. Now, with every person comes a distinct personality, And much of personality is simply hardwired into people. It's partly genetics, it's partly early childhood development, but as people grow, they sort of solidify around certain personality types. I'm thinking here of things like the Myers-Briggs indicator. Is one an introvert or an extrovert? Does one tend to process information through sensing, kind of sensing the world around them, or more internally through the sort of intuitional process? How does one make decisions? Are they primarily based on what one thinks, kind of the reasoning, rationaling process, or how one feels, kind of that gut sense and intuition? A lot of different ways that people's personalities work. Here at Woodland Hills, we found that the Myers-Briggs indicator can be super helpful in helping both friends or marriages or working together in ministry to understand each other, to realize that each of us are wired and gifted differently in terms of personality, coming to understand what the strengths and weaknesses of each of our personalities are. I mean, there's no personality that is all strength and no weakness. And learning how to love each other in the midst of those personality differences. Another area, one that's become more well known in the context of premarital counseling, is love languages. That each person is, in a sense, wired to experience love or to express love in certain ways. The famous 5 love languages of words, touch, gifts, acts of service, or quality time together really can help friends, not just marriages, but friendships, understand how the other party sees and understands love. If one person, for example, is highly wired to express and to receive love through words, but another person, say, grew up in a context where words were often cheap, where people could talk a good game but never back it up, that friendship, for example, is going to have a little bit of difficulty navigating how to express love between themselves in a way that's going to be actually believable to both parties. So getting love languages straight, not just for romantic relationships, but in friendships, is crucial. Then there's communication styles. Is one, for example, an external or an internal processor? Being someone who's a high internal processor, it can be tough for my friends sometimes, in the sense that so much of what I think, I have to think through personally, internally, before I'd ever speak it out. That can cause some of my friendships to feel like they don't know me that well. I just don't have a high sense of need to externalize my thoughts most of the time. On the other hand, when someone's an external processor, they've got to be careful at times to not over-process things and sort of flood the conversation. Once again, both internal processors like myself and external processors like friends I have, both of us have strengths and also weaknesses that we have to modulate for the relationship to be healthy. And then there's a whole range of what we could call sorting systems. Again, most of these I think are hardwired into people, but they produce very different sorts of ways that we see the world around us. Here's a few examples. Some people, as they come into a situation, instantly notice things that are the same or in common to what they've experienced before, or to, say, values and beliefs they hold. Other people, when they come into that same situation, don't see what's similar to their past experience and personal values. They see what's off, wrong, and different. Now, neither of those styles are better or worse than the other. They just are. The question is, how do we manage them? For someone who sees things just naturally different from what their past or values are, they can easily come across as critical, when really they're not being critical, it's just what they notice first. Conversely, those who see things the same or look for common ground can often come into situations where a critical eye is needed, where constructive criticism is called for, and it will be difficult for them to give that. They've got to do a little extra work to actually be able to challenge. And so together, once again, those who sort by sameness and those who sort by difference, well, we have to know that about each other and learn how to balance and modulate our strengths and weaknesses in those areas. Other people, they sort by self, where another group can sort by others. Now, this is a tricky one because all of us are called to self-sacrificial agape love. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the fact when someone comes into a new situation, some of us are simply wired to see how does that situation impact us, where others can come into that same situation and what they notice first is how that situation is impacting someone else. It's not about being good or bad, righteous or unrighteous. It's just, again, how we notice things. Both are gifts. Both have to be modulated. Both have to be understood by friends in parties in the friendship. Another dimension here is an activist versus a reflector. Some people are naturally wired to want to move quickly on things, to push things forward, to progress. Others, they want to do that, but they want to do that after they've thought carefully about the ramifications of moving into something or pressing ahead. Both are necessary. If the world had only reflectors, we wouldn't have much movement. And if it had only activists, we wouldn't have much wise movement. Together, using all of the roundedness of our gifts as a body, or in a friendship, or in a marriage, or in a church family, these things become blessings, as long as we use them wisely and know what's true about each other. Here's a fascinating one. How each of us process the passing of time. Some people are in-time people, and some are through-time people. I'm a strong in-time person. Now, what these two categories are is this. An in-time person like myself can be, for example, having an experience in a conversation or what have you, and they just don't notice the passing of time. This happens to me all the time where I'll be, say, teaching a class, and I think to myself, what time is it? And I have no idea. I couldn't tell you if 10 minutes has passed or 30 minutes. It just doesn't dawn on me. Others, they're through-time people. They have just this ability to roughly sense where we are, how long we've been here, and roughly what time it is. One's not good and one's not bad, it just is. But if these two types of people, let's say, get married or have a friendship, and don't realize the difference here, this can cause a lot of misunderstanding and tension and frustration with each other. On the other hand, if these differences are talked through, and each can appreciate the difference the other brings to this relationship, then the friendship can be strong, solid, and actually stronger because of this diversity of perspectives in the world. With all this complexity to friendships, certainly makes me wonder, why is it that when a couple is about to get married, we often encourage them to do premarital counseling? But the same difficulties and complexities of the marriage relationship also happen in the context of friendship relationships. Why don't we have premarital friendship counseling? Perhaps if we thought more intentionally about what it means to be a friend, what it means to be in a relationship, and clarifying all of these different dynamics of human relationality, perhaps we'd take more seriously preparing for friendship, maintaining our friendships, and even when our friendships are in trouble, when the stresses and tensions and conflict of life hit a friendship, that instead of giving up on it or quietly moving on to find a new friend, perhaps we'll have friendship and marriage counseling, just like we do marriage counseling for marriages in trouble. This, I think, is exactly what the church should be offering. It should value friendships as well as marriages, as well as church communities. And when those relationships get in trouble, instead of abandoning them, come around them and preserve and protect them, because it is those relationships, us people in relationships, that image the triune God. We are called to protect and nurture those relationships, not abandon them. I touched on personality. Let me talk about a distinction. Another distinction that's very important in all relationships, including friendship. And that's the distinction between personality on one hand and character on the other. Personality, again, that's usually a hardwired dimension to people. They're either gregarious or quiet. They're either introverted or extroverted. They're either in time or through time. All of these things are part of our personality. Then there's character. Character, that isn't hardwired. Character is something we develop. And we can either develop it towards Christ-likeness or away from Christ-likeness. Character is either something we're forming towards loving relationships or forming towards self-centered relationships. Oftentimes we're attracted to friends because of their personality, but it takes a while to know the character. Personality, that can generally be known pretty quickly. Character takes time to see what do I do and what does my friend do when push comes to shove. When we're in a difficult spot, do I tend to default to myself or do I default to my friend? Agape love calls us to put others before self. Jesus modeled this way of life. Character is the dimension of our lives that we can build into and nurture, express in our relationships, each of them shaping us more and more into the self-sacrificial, other-oriented image of Jesus Christ. So here's the problem. We can be attracted to someone's personality, but if our characters aren't growing in love, frequently it's character issues that break relationships. Here's another important distinction. I'll talk for a minute about covenant now, though this can apply to broader relationships beyond covenant as well. But in covenant, we talk about the terms of a covenant. The terms, again, are simply what it is we promise to each other so that we know what love will look like in this particular relationship. So the terms of a covenant are important. One could say even if one doesn't have a formal covenant, that it's still important to talk through the terms of a friendship, the terms of a marriage, the terms of a church community. What do we expect from each other in terms of how love will look in this community? Always wise to set terms out. But there's a difference between terms and what I'll call practices. Terms of a covenant, or of any relationship, should be clear, but only as many as necessary, and always as few as possible. I think that's a good principle for creating terms of a covenant. For example, Jesus' terms for our new covenant with him are simply two terms. Love God, love others, as Jesus loved us. Those are the terms of the new covenant. But the practices, well, those go on endlessly. How do I love God? And how do I love others? The terms are two and they're simple and pretty straightforward. The practices can be many and varied over the course of our life. This is a good principle in relationships. To talk through what will love look like in this friendship, let's say, but then to ask the question, what practices will we share together as friends so that we can learn to keep and grow in the terms that we're sharing together? Let me give you one concrete example where this really is an important distinction. I talked about the 9 women who entered into a friendship covenant that I was able to lead in this ceremony. They thought through the important difference between terms and practices beforehand, which was good. Here's why. It turned out that within a relatively short time of the covenant happening, several of the members over the next year or two moved away from the Twin Cities where this covenant happened. Now, if they had promised each other, let's say, that one of their terms would be meeting for dinner as a group every week. Well, when one of them had to move literally to another continent, that would have forced that person to break the covenant. So wisely, they didn't make a promise that concrete. What they promised was to stay in communication with each other. But they let the practices, the more specific things, change over time. If terms are kept basic, heart orientation sorts of commitments, the practices then can change seasonally through life as life takes us in different seasons in our relationships. One can have a committed friendship forever, but how one practices that friendship might change as distance or season of life transpire over the long haul. Terms versus practices.